My name is Barbara Duncan, and I am 73 years old. I have spent most of those years not thinking of myself as anything in particular, just Mom to my son, Barbara to my friends, Mrs. Duncan at the bank, and that sweet lady with the roses to the neighbors. Sometimes, late at night when I'm peeling an orange over the sink, I remember that I was once Barb to someone, and for a while Bunny to my late husband, but those names have faded. Only my son David remains constant. David was my only child. I say was, though he is alive and very much here, because a mother's child, no matter how old, is a different person than the man the world sees. I suppose every mother thinks this, that her child is like a nestling bird, even if he's grown feathers and built a nest of his own. I raised him mostly on my own, after my husband George died when David was 12. Our house was small, a white bungalow with a lilac bush out front and a narrow kitchen that always smelled of toast or soup. I worked as a librarian, which meant I always brought home stories, sometimes in my head, sometimes in my bag, sometimes in the way I tried to make each day interesting. I suppose I clung to the habit of stories because they kept me tethered to something larger than bills and chores and the endless repetition of laundry. David was a good boy. He was shy around strangers, had the gentlest hands. He once spent a week nursing a wounded sparrow in a shoebox, and the sort of curiosity that led to muddy knees, burnt toast, and pockets full of inexplicable treasures. I remember him running through the house in his red bathrobe, dragging behind him a battered teddy bear with a missing eye, solemnly curing its ailments with band-aids and whispered reassurances. Sometimes I'd catch him sitting cross-legged on the floor, tongue sticking out, trying to teach the dog how to shake. The dog, an old mutt named Leo, always played along. That was the thing about David. Even animals seemed to trust him. Years passed the way years do, slowly and then all at once. There were scraped knees, report cards, forgotten lunches, and winter nights when we'd both end up on the couch, watching I Love Lucy reruns. David's head against my shoulder. At 13, he brought home a puppy he'd found behind the grocery store, skin and bones and big, frightened eyes. "We can't keep him," I said, but of course we did. David named him Lucky. He saved that dog the way he saved everything that looked breakable or lonely. It was always just the two of us, but I never felt alone. I learned the rhythm of his laughter, a sound I could recognize in any crowd, any room, even now, 50 years later. It's funny, the things that stick with you. The little scars on his left hand from climbing the neighbor's fence, the way his eyes would light up when he learned something new, the messes, the triumphs, the days that seemed endless until they were gone. Now I live in a smaller house, closer to David and his family. I keep roses on my windowsill and stacks of books on every table. Most days I walk to the corner bakery for coffee and a scone. The young girl behind the counter calls me Mrs. D and asks about my son and grandkids. David visits when he can. He's busy, he always was, even as a child, and more so now, with a business and a family and a calendar so packed I can see it in his eyes. Sometimes I wish he would slow down. Sometimes I wish I could stop time, just for a day, and make him sit with me on the couch the way we used to. For his 50th birthday, David decided to have a big celebration. Not just a dinner at home, but a real party, a rented hall, linen tablecloths, a projector for old photos, and a guest list as long as my arm. He invited everyone, colleagues, cousins, neighbors, even friends from elementary school I hadn't heard about in decades. His wife, Anne, handled the details. She's efficient, always has a clipboard or a phone in her hand. Their two children, my grandchildren, were tasked with finding photos and making a slideshow. They're grown now, with busy lives of their own. Time moves in circles. I felt honored and a little anxious. David's 50th was not just a milestone for him, but for me, too. I wanted to say something, not a long speech, just a few words from a mother who has watched 50 years spool out, who has seen the small, ordinary days stack into a life. So I wrote a toast. I wrote it the way I write everything, at my kitchen table, with a mug of tea, the window open to let in the morning air. I wrote about the red bathrobe, about the teddy bear named Doctor, about the time he stood up to a neighbor boy for stealing someone's bike. I wrote about the puppy he saved and the laughter that filled our little house. I wanted to say that even now, when I see him, I see all the versions of him, the boy, the teenager, the young man, the father, the son. I wrote it all down. It was not clever or polished, but it was true. The night before the party, I read it aloud to myself in the kitchen. I tried not to cry, but my voice wobbled. I knew it wouldn't be perfect, but I hoped in the middle of a big room full of people, my words might reach him, just for a moment. The morning of David's party, I woke before sunrise. For a while, I just lay in bed, listening to the hush. There was a faint ache in my knees, an old ache I'd learned to live with, and the restless flutter in my stomach that always came before family gatherings. I watched the ceiling shift from dark blue to pearly gray, thinking of everything I'd written in my toast, repeating phrases in my head like prayers, trying to commit them to memory. By 7, the house smelled of oatmeal and rosewater. I set out my dress, a deep navy, simple, but with small mother-of-pearl buttons down the front. I'd worn it for David's college graduation, his wedding, and now, for this, another milestone, another proof that life moves on, regardless of our readiness. I checked the sheet with my speech 3 times, first in my bag, then my coat pocket, and finally tucked in my purse, folded twice. I made sure I had tissues. I put on a pair of earrings, ones I almost never wore, because they always seemed too much, but today felt right. Before leaving, I looked at myself in the hallway mirror, hair curled, a careful trace of lipstick, a smile that felt both old and new. "Don't be nervous," I whispered, as if I could calm the woman inside. Anne had insisted on sending a car. When it arrived, the driver, a young man with a neat haircut and a ready grin, helped me into the back seat and wished me, "Congratulations." It sounded strange, as if the day belonged to me. On the way to the hall, I watched the city roll by. The bakery, the park where David played catch, the tiny bookstore we used to visit on Saturdays. All the places that built our history, now sliding past glass, slightly blurred. I tried to steady my breathing, holding the sheet in my hand like a charm. The banquet hall was larger than I'd expected. High ceilings, chandeliers, round tables dressed in white linen, glass vases with blue hydrangeas, which I guessed were Anne's touch. Someone was already running cables from a laptop to a projector. On one wall, a looping slideshow. David's baby photos, awkward school pictures, David in a suit at his wedding, David with his children. Laughter drifted in from the entrance, a current of old friends and relatives, faces I hadn't seen in decades, all orbiting around my son. People arrived in waves. I was hugged and congratulated as the matriarch, posed for photos next to David and Anne and the grandchildren. Each introduction was like a little performance, all of us acting out the roles we've worn for years. Someone handed me a glass of punch. A cousin reminisced about camping trips from the 70s. Another about how David once broke his arm climbing a tree. I nodded and smiled, my attention always returning to the folded sheet in my purse. I wanted, more than anything, for my words to fit into this sea of noise and movement, to not sound old or out of place. After the meal, roast chicken, 2 salads, potatoes, tiny cheesecakes, Anne took the microphone. She called everyone to attention. thanking guests for coming, telling an affectionate story about meeting David in college, about how he was always the kind of person who took care of others. People clapped. There was a feeling of warmth, a pleasant buzz in the air. A few more friends spoke, colleagues from David's work, his oldest friend Tom, and finally Maya, my sister-in-law, the one who'd always been the voice of the family. Maya had a way with words, sharp, funny, always in control. She told a story about David lending her money for her first car, joked about their rivalry as children. Everyone laughed, even David. The crowd was with her, their faces open and smiling. I waited, holding my speech in my lap, my fingers tracing the folded edge. I watched David across the room. He was standing with his arm around Anne, listening, smiling, glancing now and then at the projector, at his own face from decades past. My heart fluttered. I told myself, soon, just a few more toasts, then it will be my turn. You don't have to be perfect, just honest. Anne caught my eye from across the room and gave a small, encouraging nod. I took that as my sign. I stood up slowly, knees stiff, careful not to drop the sheet. I walked to the edge of the table, smoothed my dress, cleared my throat softly, and reached for the microphone. Before I could speak, I felt a gentle touch on my elbow. I turned. Maya was beside me, her hand warm but insistent. She leaned in and whispered, voice pitched for my ears only, "Mom, let's not do another toast. This has gone on long enough as it is. I'd rather speak for everyone." Her words fell softly, but each one landed with the weight of a stone. I looked at her. For a split second, I expected to see a joke in her eyes, a silent wink, some clue that this was not as it sounded. But her expression was earnest, businesslike, the same face she'd worn when organizing family reunions or dividing up chores after Christmas dinner. Behind her, David was speaking to someone, half turned away, not making eye contact. He didn't see. I hesitated. I wanted to say, "It's only a few words." I wanted to say, "This is important to me." But instead, I nodded. I smiled, small, careful, and folded the sheet, once, then twice, then tucked it into my purse. Maya took the microphone. "Let's have a round of applause for David." People clapped, loud and generous. Maya told another story, this time about a family trip to Niagara Falls, David rescuing her from a tumble, all eyes and laughter focused on her. I sat down quietly, feeling the smooth paper in my purse, cool against my palm. I watched my son, waiting for him to glance over, to meet my gaze, to maybe notice the tiny tremor in my hand. But he didn't. He was laughing at something Anne whispered, his head thrown back, eyes bright. The moment passed. Music started, and people moved to the dance floor. Plates were cleared. Someone put on a video montage, and everyone gathered around, pointing and laughing at pictures of David in his high school football uniform, his awkward bowl haircut, his first car. All around me, the party continued, loud, bright, familiar. And I sat in the middle of it, invisible and silent, the words I'd written folded away, pressing softly against my heart. That night, the party blurred around me like rain on glass. After Maya's toast, after the video montage, after the cake, 3 tears, blue icing, "Happy 50th, David," piped in perfect cursive. The room grew heavier, as if all the laughter and movement pressed down into the tablecloths and carpet. For the rest of the evening, I drifted from group to group, shaking hands, exchanging practiced pleasantries, feeling myself shrink a little more each time I was asked, "Are you having fun, Barbara?" Or, "Isn't this wonderful?" I nodded, I smiled. I made a mental note of who had shown up, who had not, who had changed the most since I'd last seen them. But inside, I was far away. There's a kind of silence that grows inside you, quietly at first, and then, once it finds its shape, fills the whole room. Mine was a pillow pressed softly over my mouth. Everything sounded muffled. The clatter of cutlery, the thump of music, the bursts of laughter from the dance floor, all seemed to echo from another world, one I could see but not quite reach. I sat at a small round table in the corner, hands folded over my purse, feeling the outline of my speech through the thin fabric. Now and then, someone sat beside me for a moment, a cousin, a neighbor, one of David's old friends. They asked about my health, complimented my dress, told stories about David as a child. I listened, offering small, agreeable replies. No one asked if I wanted to speak. Every so often, I watched my son. David was everywhere, on the dance floor with his wife, at the bar talking to colleagues, kneeling beside his grandchildren as they played with balloons. He laughed, and for a moment I heard that old, unguarded laugh from his boyhood, the one that bubbled up from somewhere pure and unself-conscious. I wanted to hold that moment, to step into it, to offer my toast not to the man everyone else saw, but to the child I still carried in memory. I wondered quietly if what I wanted to say about bathrobes and teddy bears, about the small acts of kindness no one else remembered, was simply out of place now. Maybe my memories belonged to a version of David no one else recognized. Maybe it was right, after all, that Maya spoke. She could tie the past to the present, gather up all the threads. Maybe the story of a mother and her son was too small for this big, glittering room. Around me, the party faded by degrees. People hugged goodbye, promising to call, to meet for coffee, to get together more often. Anne was rounding up leftovers and gifts. Grandchildren dozed in chairs. Someone offered me a ride home, but I declined, saying I preferred to wait for the car Anne had ordered. As I waited, I took out the sheet of paper one last time. I read the first line to myself, quietly, under the soft glow of the sideboard lamp. My son wore a red bathrobe and healed 1,000 imaginary wounds. I stopped. I folded it carefully, as if folding a flag. The car ride home was quiet. The driver, an older man this time, kept the radio low, playing golden oldies. I watched the city slide by again, same streets, now bathed in amber streetlights. The windows of other homes glowed with little pockets of family, silhouettes passing, laughter sometimes drifting onto the sidewalk. At one intersection, we stopped for a red light. I saw a mother and her grown daughter walking together, arms linked, laughing about something private. I felt a pang, a longing so sharp it startled me. When I reached home, the house felt colder than usual. I slipped off my shoes and padded to the kitchen. The clock on the stove blinked 11:48. I set my purse on the counter and made tea out of habit, though I wasn't sure I wanted it. In the quiet, I heard all the words I hadn't spoken echo back to me. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the little sheet of paper, now creased at the corners. I thought about why I'd written it, not for applause, not for show, but because words were the only way I'd ever known to offer love. David would never know how much it meant. Maybe that was how things worked now, our stories living quietly inside us, unspoken, until they faded to nothing. But as the night wore on and the silence thickened, a small thought took root in me, stubborn as a weed. Perhaps it wasn't true that no one needed these words. Maybe, just maybe, someone else out there, in the wide world of forgotten mothers and overlooked grandmothers, would understand what it meant to have a heart full of unsaid things. Maybe the words mattered, even if they were no longer the format. I went to bed late. The speech stayed on my nightstand, the last thing I saw before closing my eyes. I dreamed of David as a little boy, in his red bathrobe, laughing up at me from the foot of the stairs. When morning came, the ache in my chest lingered. But now, there was something else, a seed of resolve, buried deep, waiting to grow. The morning after the party, I awoke to gray light leaking in through the curtains. My head was full of half-remembered conversations and the kind of tiredness that sits behind your eyes. For a moment, I lingered in the warmth of the sheets, the dream of David's childhood laughter still echoing faintly in my mind. Then the ache returned, the familiar ache of words left unsaid, of love that hadn't quite landed. I made coffee, fed the cat, and wandered through the quiet house in my slippers. The roses on the windowsill needed water. I clipped off the browning leaves, thinking of the ways we try to keep things beautiful, even as time asks us to let go. I spent the morning pretending to read, an old mystery novel I'd read twice already, but found myself drifting, each sentence dissolving into the background hum of the day before. Now and then, I'd reach for my purse, thumb the folded sheet of paper, and then tuck it away again, embarrassed at how childish I felt. The phone rang. Anne, brisk and bright as always, calling to check if I'd made it home all right. "We'll bring the kids by this weekend, Mom," she said. "They want to show you the video they made for Grandpa's party." I told her I'd love to see them. I didn't mention the speech. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen, fingers tracing the rim of my coffee cup. The room was filled with small, comforting noises, the refrigerator's hum, the cat's paws on the linoleum, the distant chime of a neighbor's wind bell. I tried to settle back into my routines, laundry, sorting old photos, watering the ferns, but my mind kept circling the same question. If what I wanted to say wasn't needed at the party, then who was it for? Was it selfish to want to be heard? Or was it something deeper, a longing to connect, to have my memories, my love, my life witnessed by someone who cared? That evening, I took a walk around the block. It was spring. The air was cool and full of lilac. Neighbors waved from porches. I watched children chase a soccer ball down the sidewalk and felt both envy and pride, the wild energy of youth, the deep patience of age. A block away, the library windows glowed warmly. I paused outside, remembering the hundreds of evenings spent shelving books, the quiet satisfaction of putting things in order, of watching shy children grow into curious adults. I missed that. A place where my voice had value, where my words shaped the world in some small way. Back home, the house felt even quieter. I made myself dinner, half a sandwich, a bowl of soup. I ate slowly, thinking. On the television, the news anchor spoke of distant places and events that seemed impossibly far away. I muted the sound and sat in the hush, my mind spinning. That's when I remembered my granddaughter Emma's words, spoken offhand one Sunday after church. "Grandma, you should start a channel. Everybody shares everything now." I had laughed at the time, brushing it off as something for younger people, for those with shinier lives and newer stories. But now the idea returned, insistent and strange. I opened my laptop, the one Emma had helped me set up last Christmas, the one I mostly used for recipes and emails, and stared at the blank screen for a long time. I hesitated, hands poised above the keyboard, unsure where to begin. I looked at the little camera above the monitor, its tiny glass eye, patient and waiting. It took me 3 tries to find the record button. The first 2 attempts captured only the top of my head and a slant of sunlight across the kitchen wall. I nearly gave up. But on the 3rd try, I sat down at the table, unfolded my speech, and pressed record. The screen glowed softly. The house was silent. I began, voice shaking. "Hello, my name is Barbara Duncan. This is what I didn't say at my son's 50th birthday party." I paused, breathing in the familiar scent of tea and old paper. Then I read, slowly, carefully, just as I had rehearsed the night before the party. I spoke of the red bathrobe, of teddy bears and scraped knees, of the laugh I'd know anywhere, of the kind of love that doesn't end when your child grows taller than you. I spoke not to the camera, but to the space between us, the space where love sits unspoken, waiting to be seen. There was no theater, no grand performance, just me, my words, and the quiet pulse of longing that had driven me to this moment. When I finished, I sat back, blinking away tears. For a moment, I considered deleting the video. Who would care anyway? But something in me, stubborn and small, said no. I titled it, What I Didn't Say at My Son's Birthday Party. I uploaded it to the site Emma had shown me, stumbling through the steps, double checking everything 3 times. When it was done, I closed the laptop and sat very still, hands in my lap, listening to the house breathe around me. The next morning, I almost regretted it. The world seemed unchanged. Birds at the feeder, the mail slot clattering, the hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. But beneath the ordinary, I felt something different, a kind of electricity, a trembling possibility. For the first time since the party, I was no longer rehearsing my words in the darkness. I had spoken. The silence had shifted just a little, as if the world had made room for me again. The first day after uploading the video, nothing much happened. I made my bed, straightened the cushions in the living room, and watered the roses. Every so often, I'd wander into the kitchen and glance at the laptop as if expecting it to blink or chime, some sign that the world had changed because I had pressed share. Of course, the screen stayed silent. I told myself it didn't matter. The important thing was that I had done it, that the silence was broken in my own small way. That afternoon, I visited the bakery on the corner for a scone and a cup of tea. I sat by the window watching the comings and goings on Main Street, the mailman's careful stride, a pair of teenagers with matching backpacks, a mother corralling 2 giggling toddlers. Life moved as it always had, and I found comfort in the ordinariness of it all. When I got home, I checked the video. 5 views. No comments? I shrugged, told myself again it didn't matter. Still, a tiny flutter of disappointment worked its way under my ribs. After dinner, I wrote a letter to my friend Rita, longhand as always, then watched a nature program until my eyelids grew heavy. The video, I decided, would drift quietly into the sea of other unnoticed things. A half-finished quilt, a garden plan sketched on the back of a receipt, the song I used to hum to David when he was small. The next morning, as I poured milk into my tea, the cat, Cleo, meowed insistently, circling my ankles. I set down the cup and checked my email. To my surprise, there was a new notification. You have a comment. My heart gave a little skip. I clicked the link and read, This is the warmest toast I've ever heard, even without a glass. Thank you for sharing. It was signed only Linda S. I didn't know her, but her words wrapped around me like a knitted shawl. Throughout the day, more notifications arrived. Each time, I paused whatever I was doing, a load of laundry, trimming the hydrangeas, folding towels, and hurried to the computer. The view count crept upward. 12, then 25, then 100. I watched, astonished, as strangers replied with stories of their own. You sound just like my mom. I lost her last year. Thank you for reminding me. I couldn't speak at my daughter's wedding, froze right up, but your words felt like mine. Crying at my desk. My son turns 40 soon. I hope I can find the right words. Some comments were simple, just hearts, or thank you, or beautiful. Others told whole histories, regrets, missed chances, memories of childhoods that sounded a lot like mine and David's. As I read, I felt the ache in my chest shift, softening, loosening, changing into something else. I made myself a fresh cup of tea and sat by the window with Cleo in my lap, reading each comment slowly, sometimes twice. My video, just me and my trembling voice, reading words no one wanted to hear in a crowded banquet hall, had found a home with strangers across the country. I imagined women like me, sitting alone in their kitchens, watching in the quiet, wiping a tear from the corner of their eye. By the end of the week, the video had reached 30,000 views. The number itself was meaningless in some ways. What mattered were the messages. Hundreds of them, each a little thread woven into a tapestry I never knew existed. A man from Vermont wrote about his mother's hands, always warm even when she was angry. A young woman from Oregon sent a photo of her grandmother's handwritten recipes, saying, "This made me call her." A teacher in Florida played my toast to her students as an example of speaking from the heart. I read every message, often aloud, letting their stories join mine in the soft light of my kitchen. One afternoon, as I read another new comment, a different kind of notification appeared. It was an email from the site itself, an invitation to feature your video on our community page. I stared at the screen, uncertain. I'd never been featured before in any sense of the word. But I clicked yes, and that night, the number of views doubled. With each message, I felt less alone. For years, I'd feared that my memories had become irrelevant, that the world no longer needed a mother's stories, that love in its quietest form was old-fashioned, unnecessary. Now, strangers told me otherwise. They told me my words mattered, even as they filled the spaces left by their own unsaid things. That Sunday, Emma came by with Anne and the grandkids. After lunch, while the children played outside, Emma sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. "Grandma, did you go viral?" she asked, eyes wide, half joking. "I don't know," I said, smiling. "Maybe a little." Emma hugged me, her arms strong and sure. "I'm so proud of you." It was a small thing, but I felt something inside me settle. Not pride exactly, but peace. Late that night, as the house settled into quiet again, I returned to the laptop and read through the comments once more. Each word was a small light, flickering against the darkness of all the years I'd thought my voice had gone unheard. For the first time in a long while, I felt that the silence was over, not because the world had changed, but because I had changed my place in it. The days after the video went viral, as Emma put it, felt strange and dreamlike. My daily life didn't change much. There was still laundry to fold, mail to sort, the same walk to the bakery each morning. Yet everywhere I went, I carried a new weight, a sense of having done something both daring and irrevocable. I found myself replaying the sound of my own voice from the video in my head, hearing its hesitations and quivers, but also the warmth and truth threaded through each line. Neighbors began to mention the video. At the bakery, Margot leaned over the counter and said, "Barbara, I saw your video online. It made me think of my mother, called her right after." At the library, one of the younger librarians gave me a shy wave, murmuring, "You're famous now." There was no malice in it, just a gentle kind of surprise, a curiosity at seeing someone like me, someone quiet, someone older, speaking out in a world that so often moves too fast for us. But beneath the surface, I knew there was unfinished business. I hadn't heard from David. Days passed. I told myself he was busy. He always was, after all, running his business, managing the endless stream of responsibilities that seemed to crowd every hour of his life. But as each evening settled and no call came, my heart grew restless. It happened on a Thursday. The sun was just slipping behind the row of houses across the street when I heard the email alert ding. I wiped my hands on a tea towel and sat down at the kitchen table, heart thumping like a nervous bird. The subject line was simple. "Mom, why did you post that?" For a moment, I sat frozen, reading the line over and over. I imagined David at his desk, perhaps frowning at the screen, Anne leaning over his shoulder. I could picture the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was frustrated, a habit from childhood, something that always made me want to soothe him. but I was not sure this time that soothing was what either of us needed. I opened the email. It was brief. "I don't understand why you would put that on the internet. Couldn't you have just told me? Anne says people at her work have seen it. Please call me." For a long while, I stared at the message. My fingers hovered over the keys, but words failed me. I made a cup of tea, walked around the garden, tried to imagine what I would say if we were face to face. But it wasn't a face to face world, not now. Not with all the years of missed moments and habits of silence between us. I sat at my desk as the light faded and typed, slowly, carefully. "David, I wanted you to hear it. I truly did. But sometimes we don't realize what we need to say until the moment passes. So at least someone would hear it, since you didn't want to. Love, Mom." I read it 3 times before I hit send. It wasn't cruel, I told myself. It was honest. And that was something I had spent too many years being afraid of. That night, sleep was hard to come by. The house seemed too quiet, every small noise amplified. I worried that I had been unkind. I worried that I had made things worse. But beneath those worries was something new, a stubborn, hard-won clarity. The next day passed in a haze. I baked a loaf of bread, wrote a letter to Rita, answered more comments from strangers who now felt like distant friends. But every time the phone rang, a telemarketer, a neighbor, I felt a stab of anticipation, then disappointment. David did not call. The silence between us stretched out, long and taut. But this time it was not heavy or suffocating. It was honest. It had edges. I could see it for what it was, not absence, but space. A place where two grown people, mother and son, might eventually meet on their own terms. That weekend, Emma stopped by with pastries and a box of her old school books to sort for the church sale. She hugged me, as if she could sense the storm beneath the surface. "Dad will come around, Grandma," she said quietly, pouring us each a cup of tea. "He's just surprised, maybe a little embarrassed, but he saw how many people your words helped. I think deep down, he's proud of you." I squeezed her hand, grateful. That afternoon, Anne called. Her voice was careful, but not cold. "We're figuring things out, Barbara. Just give David a little time." I promised I would. The ache in my chest softened a bit. I spent the evening reading through old diaries, tracing the years from David's birth to the present, marveling at how many small moments built a life. I thought about the thousands of other mothers, sitting in their kitchens, waiting for their voices to matter. At night, the house was still. Cleo curled up at my feet, the roses on the windowsill glowing faintly in the moonlight. I whispered the words of my speech to the darkness, softly, not needing an audience now, but simply to remind myself that I was still here. And so the silence remained, but it was a new kind of silence, not empty, not shameful, just honest. Spring lingered longer than usual that year. Each morning, Barbara woke to sunlight falling through her bedroom window, the air thick with birdsong and the scent of roses blooming just outside. She moved a little slower these days, but she felt a gentle current beneath her routine, like a river quietly changing its course. In the weeks following the video, Barbara's life settled into a new, softer rhythm. She found herself less concerned about filling silences and more comfortable simply letting them be. She spent her mornings reading the paper at the kitchen table, responding to the trickle of new messages her video still attracted. Sometimes she'd find herself recognized. At the post office, a woman smiled and said, "You're the birthday toast lady." At church, a quiet man she'd known only in passing pressed her hand and thanked her for reminding us what mothers do. But what surprised her most was how, gradually, the feeling of being left out faded. In its place was a calm sense of presence. She had spoken her truth, and it had found its way in the world, floating out beyond her own small circle. It was in early May, just as the lilacs peaked, that Barbara received a call from a local number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was warm and a little breathless. "Mrs. Duncan, this is Teresa Witherspoon, producer for Radio Community. We have a program called Voices That Wouldn't Let Me Speak. One of our listeners sent us your video, and, well, we wondered if you might come in and share some of your story. Just a little reading, maybe a cup of tea in the studio." Barbara hesitated, her first instinct to say no. The idea of microphones, bright lights, and strangers made her heart race. But as she listened to Teresa's gentle invitation, she felt a flicker of something braver. Why not, after all? She had already done the hardest thing. She had spoken, alone, into the camera, not knowing if anyone would care. This time, at least, someone had asked. The day of the recording, Barbara dressed carefully in her favorite blouse, pale blue with tiny white flowers at the collar. She pressed her slacks, chose a string of pearls George had once given her, and tucked her speech into her purse, the paper now worn soft from handling. She arrived at the little radio station just past noon. It was nothing like she'd imagined. The building was old, filled with mismatched furniture and the comforting scent of coffee. Teresa met her at the door, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a slight scatter of ink on her fingers. "Would you like some tea?" Teresa asked, guiding Barbara into a cozy green room lined with faded posters and local art. They sat for a while, chatting about small things, the weather, their favorite childhood books, the roses Barbara grew by her window. When it was time, Teresa led her down a narrow hallway and into a soundproof studio. Barbara's heart hammered as she sat in front of the big silver microphone. She ran a hand over the page in her lap, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of the words. A small sign lit up, "On air." Teresa nodded encouragement. "Just speak from the heart. Take your time." Barbara took a breath and began. She read slowly, the words settling into the hush of the studio. How David had worn his red bathrobe, how he'd rescued a lost puppy, how his laughter had filled every empty space in their old house. She read of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the fierce, quiet love that sometimes has nowhere to go but into silence. Her voice shook only a little. As she read, she felt the fear draining away, replaced by a steady warmth. In the corner of her eye, she saw Teresa dab at her cheek with a tissue. When she finished, Barbara looked up, surprised by the gentle applause from the studio technician behind the glass. They talked for a few minutes about families, about what it means to speak and not be heard, and the strange comfort of finding one's words taken up by strangers. Teresa poured her more tea. "We need voices like yours, Barbara. It means something, to everyone." After the show, Barbara sat in the car outside the station, letting herself feel it all. There was no swelling music, no dramatic catharsis, just a long, quiet exhale. She realized with a kind of awe that she wasn't angry anymore. The ache of being not the format had receded. What remained was certainty. Her words, spoken and heard, were enough. A week later, the program aired. Emma called first, voice bright and proud. "Grandma, you sounded like a movie star." "Dad heard it too. He he said he cried. He wanted you to know." Barbara smiled, a soft fullness blooming in her chest. Maybe the silence between them had served its purpose, a place to pause, to grow, to learn that not every wound is mended in public, but some are healed by time and distance. Later, Anne stopped by with a small bouquet of blue hydrangeas. She hugged Barbara and said, "Thank you for loving him all these years, even when he forgot how to listen." Barbara's world had grown larger, not smaller, in the months since the party. She continued to write stories, letters, sometimes new speeches for no occasion at all. She read her favorite passages aloud into the quiet, not waiting for permission or applause. The silence in her life was no longer the silence of exclusion, but a gentle space where her voice could rest between words. And so, as spring folded into summer, Barbara tended her roses, brewed her tea, and greeted each day with the certainty that she was finally heard. She did not ask for words anymore. Now she was speaking, and that was enough.